Well, thank you much for that kind introduction. What a pleasure it is for me to be here. Probably more of a pleasure for me than for you, as it will work out. It actually has been just a spectacular day for me here in the beautiful mountains of North Carolina. I live at the other end of the Appalachian chain. My house borders on the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont. So this country's familiar but beautiful, and those green mountains looming above the campus are just spectacular. And what a splendid day it's been for me to get to wander around campus, to get to meet Chancellor Everts, and to get to have, we had a really good session today in the middle of the day with Amory and with old friends like David Orr, who you'll hear from tomorrow, and with the absolutely legendary Fred Standback, who's done so much. And then I went off maybe 5 miles off campus with Dan Blakely, and he showed me the Appalachian State solar race car that's going to be racing to the Black Hills of the Dakotas soon. Up against teams from MIT and the University of Michigan and things. I called out to Las Vegas, and the odds are right now Michigan's favorite, but I put down good money on the Aperion. And then I went off to do an interview, which was good fun, but the best part was the interview was at your magnificent brewery, Appalachian Mountain Brewery there in the middle of town. And I got to meet the brewer, and he gave me some of his new India Pale Ale brewed with coffee beans, and their creative director, an artist named Tommy Lee, he gave me a print of his new portrait of my neighbor and friend Bernie Sanders. And all in all, it was a spectacular day, just spectacular, which makes it all the harder for me to get up here in front of you with the realization that my basic role in life is just to bum people out. For which I apologize, and I will do my best to get to more hopeful terrain eventually, but there's no use kind of skipping lightly over the hard parts, because unless we understand the pace and the scale of the problem that we confront, then we do not understand the pace nor the scale of the solutions that we need to deal with it. I wrote the first book for a general audience about climate change in 1989, which I am well aware means before many of you were born, a book called The End of Nature. And at the time, we had a good sense of what was going to happen. We knew that when you burned coal and gas and oil and put lots of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, its molecular structure would trap heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. What we did not know was exactly how fast and how hard it would pinch, and the story of the intervening quarter century now is that it's pinching a lot faster and a lot harder than we ever would have suspected. If you had told scientists 25, 26 years ago that by now we would have lost half the summer sea ice in the Arctic, and we're on a record melt pace again this year, they would have said, no, that's 50 or 75 or 100 years out down the future. If you'd told them that the world's oceans were going to be 30% more acidic because the carbon in the atmosphere was changing the chemical composition of seawater, they would have looked astonished at you, because it hadn't really even occurred to anyone to start measuring the pH of the oceans. The oceans seemed too big for us to materially change, but they were not. 2014 was the hottest year we'd ever measured on this planet until 2015, and then 2015 crushed that record, and now it looks like 20 16 is going to smash every record in the book. We just came through the June that was the hottest month we've ever had, hottest June we've ever had in this nation. And with the heat wave forecast for next week across all but the Pacific Northwest, the theory is that July 2016 may turn out to be the hottest single month in American history. Last week there was a day when it was 91 degrees in Key West, Florida, which makes sense, but 96 degrees in Fairbanks, Alaska on the same day. We set the new all-time temperature record on Wednesday for the hottest temperature ever recorded within 50 miles of the shore of the Arctic Ocean in Alaska, and then we broke the record on Thursday. I was in the South Pacific in the spring, working with our crew there in the South Pacific, and the pain of those people in those places watching as most of, or half of, or something of the coral reefs that fringe those islands dying in the course of a few weeks this spring as a great wave of warm water swept across the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. And these are countries that are probably going to be underwater before the century is out, but long before that, they're now at great risk. Great risk because those reefs form so much of their natural protection. It's because that's where they get their food. We've seen in the last 18 months the highest wind speeds recorded in the Western Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere in great hurricanes that, of course, draw their power from the heat in the first few meters of the sea's surface. We've seen staggering drought because one of the things that happens when you warm the planet is that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. You get more evaporation in arid areas, and so yes, California suffers tremendously, but California is rich and can sort of deal with it. There were reports earlier this year from the parts of southern Africa that are locked in just a horrendous drought, one of the worst ever recorded. And their people were literally eating their seed corn because they had nothing else to eat. That's about as desperate as it gets, or almost as desperate as it gets. Up across our hemisphere, we've seen this year the spread on the wings of Aedes aegypti, the mosquito that has colonized so much of this warmer, wetter world that we have created on its behalf. We've seen the spread of this Zika virus, and we have seen the health ministers of 5 nations tell women not to become pregnant. Think about that for a minute. That's like something out of a science fiction story. It's hard to imagine. Hard to imagine. And the dangerous part is that it's still near the beginning of this story. We have raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree so far, Celsius. We're headed, if we indeed follow the pledges and promises that all the countries of the world made in the Paris Climate Accords last December, we're headed for a world that's something like 3.5 degrees Celsius warmer. That is, we're headed for a planet that literally will not work, that cannot support the kind of civilizations that we're used to, that cannot grow the food, that will not have the weather, that will, this is the biggest thing humans have ever done. The most important thing that happened in the lifetime of everybody in this room was that we left behind the Holocene, the 10,000-year period of benign climatic stability that coincided, but not coincidentally, with the rise of human civilization. We are out of it now. We're into some new, much warmer world. We don't really have a name for it. The question, and the only question, is how far into that world we're going to go. It is the most freighted question that humans have ever faced. It is the most important task we have ever had to try and slow it down. Okay, that's the bad part. You can take a breath. I will take a breath. And I'll give you a piece of good news, which is that we could stop or at least slow a good deal of this from happening. We know something else that we didn't know 25 or 30 years ago, which is what we could do to replace the coal and gas and oil that we've been burning in such quantity. When we talked about renewable energy a quarter century ago, sometimes we did it with our fingers crossed because it wasn't quite ready yet for prime time. There were great pioneers like Amory Lovins out there on the forefront, but it hadn't reached the rest of us yet. That is no longer the case. In the last 10 years, the price of a solar panel has come down 80% or more because the engineers have done their job. All over the world, the equivalent of those Appalachian students out in the garage tinkering with their solar race car have been doing the same sort of thing on every kind of renewable energy device that we can think of. Their efficiency is increasing exponentially, and we can tell what it means because in the few places that have really tried, the results have been spectacular. The Danes last year generated 49% of their power from the wind, which either means that Denmark has, in some sinister way, conspired to steal most of the world's supply of breeze, or it means that they have the political will to put to use the technologies now available to everyone. There are days when the Germans generate close to all the power they use, from all the electricity they use, from solar panels within their borders. In Germany, okay? No one ever went to Germany for a beach vacation, okay? Think what you might be able to do in a country that had, I don't know, Florida, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, California, Texas, North Carolina to work with, okay? But we're not doing it. So if the bad news was that we faced a great threat, the greatest of threats, and the good news was that we more or less knew what we needed to do about it, the crazy-making news is that we're not, and the question becomes why? Why are we moving so slowly, falling each year farther behind the curve of physics? That's a good question that took me too long to figure out. I'm a writer. I'm like some of the people in this room, an academic, okay? So we have a particular way of looking at the world. My theory of change when I was 27 and wrote The End of Nature, my theory of change was people will read my book and then they will change, okay? They did read the book. It came out in like 24 languages, but it turns out that's not quite how it works. I continued to think, though, that we were having an argument, and so it'd be good to write more books, and we'd have more symposiums and give more speeches and so on and so forth, and eventually we would win the argument, and then the people who led our societies would change, and it took me much too long to figure out that was not what was going on. We weren't having an argument. The argument was settled by the mid-1990s when the world scientists in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, all the world's climate scientists gathered together, said, yep, we're warming the planet, it's dangerous, here's what to do. That was pretty much the end of the argument. It turned out, though, that what we were having was a fight. And a fight is not about data or reason, the fight is always about money and power. That's what we were engaged in, and there was another side to this fight, and the other side was the fossil fuel industry, which is the richest industry that the world has ever known, and hence the most politically powerful. And that industry was willing to use that political power and political might to keep change from happening, even at the cost of breaking the planet. That sounds like hyperbole, okay? That sounds like it's exaggeration and too much and too strong and partisan and unpleasant. Earlier, September of last year, investigative journalists from the Pulitzer Prize-winning Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times and the Columbia Journalism School began publishing a series of independent reports that corroborated each other, but from different whistleblowers and different archives of documents, and they all showed the same fascinating thing, which was that the biggest of the fossil fuel companies, Exxon, had known absolutely everything there was to know about climate change as early as the late 1970s, certainly by the mid-1980s. They had the best scientists. Their business was carbon, and they made their business to understand it, and they understood it well. They predicted for their management how fast the planet was going to warm, and they were taken entirely seriously. That information informed Exxon's and probably other companies' plans for drilling in the Arctic they knew would melt. It informed their own infrastructure. They started building all their drilling rigs to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was coming. What they didn't do was tell any of the rest of us. Just the opposite. They invested tens of millions of dollars in helping build the architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that has kept us locked in a faux, phony, sterile debate about the reality of climate change for a quarter century. If this CEO of Exxon had simply stood up in 1989 after Jim Hansen, the NASA scientist, testified before Congress, if he'd simply stood up and said, you know what, that's what our scientists are saying too, no one would have said, well, Exxon's just a bunch of climate alarmists. They would have said, okay, we got a problem, let's go to work. We would not have solved global warming at this point, but we'd be well on the way to solving it, and instead we are 25 years deeper into a very deep hole at this point. That's what I mean by power and money. And so at a certain point, it occurred finally to me, much too late, and I kick myself for the lateness of this realization, it occurred to me that perhaps we best come up with some power of our own if we were going to have some chance of standing up to it. It was not going to be money. Exxon made more money for the last 5 years than any company in the history of money, okay? So we were not going to match that. We were going to have to find a different currency to work in, and history, the history suggested, say, by the fact that it's Nelson Mandela Day, history suggested that the currency we're going to have to work in was the currency of movements, of passion, of spirit, of creativity, of the willingness to, once in a while, spend your body and go to jail. Because that's how it's happened in the past. And so we decided to try and go to work not knowing anything about this. I'm, as you can tell, by nature, not an activist and an organizer. I'm not a very good speaker. That's because I'm a writer. Writers are by and large introverts. It's a pleasure to be here with you, but actually I'd rather be home in my room typing, okay? That's what I like to do. But we decided we best try. And so try we did. I got together with 7 students at Middlebury College in Vermont, a little college where I teach some at the other end of the Appalachians. And, it's students like the ones I've been meeting today, 7 kids, and we decided we would try and organize around climate change. I might show you a picture or two in a minute. If Todd, do you know what happened to that clicker that was out here? I see it's on the ground. We decided we'd do a little organizing, okay? And we formed this thing that we called 350.org, a strange name, a name taken from science. Scientists had just told us 10 years ago that 350 parts per million CO2 was as much as we could safely have in the atmosphere, a number we're already way past. We passed 400 parts per million last year. We're going up about 3 parts per million per year. That's why the Arctic melts. That's why Siberia's on fire right now. That's why the coral is dead. That's why we're in such trouble. We took the name in part because this was the first global problem we wanted to organize globally. And we figured numbers would work better than words for that task because 350 mean the same thing everywhere in the world, in Boone and in Beijing. And so we set out to work. Now, you might find it somewhat preposterous that we decided to do this, and in fact, you would be correct. There were 7 undergraduates. There are 7 continents. Each one took one. The one who took the Antarctic also had to take the internet. Okay, so off we went to work, and our work was to find other people like ourselves around the world. And they're not everywhere someone that you'd call an environmentalist, but there's everywhere someone worried about hunger, about public health, about development, about women's rights, about all the things we cannot have on a planet that's rapidly deteriorating. And they were our natural allies, and we found them wherever we looked, and we said to everybody, let's take a day. Let's just pick a day at random and try and drive this number into the information bloodstream of the planet. Everybody try and do something wherever you are that day. Now, we had no idea. We didn't have any money or any lists or anything. We didn't know how well this would work. We got the first sense that it might work a little bit 2 days early. We were supposed to do this on a Saturday, and that Thursday we were sitting around our one-room office in Vermont, and the phone rang, the satellite phone, and it was our leader in Ethiopia. And like all of us, she was a volunteer, and like most of us, she was a she, and like a surprising number of us, she was 17, and she was in tears, and she said the government took away our permit for Saturday, so we're doing this today before they can stop us. Now that was brave, because it's not a particularly nice government, but that wasn't why she was crying. She just kept saying, we wanted to do this the same day as everybody else. We want to be part of the whole big, we don't want to spoil it for people. We're so sorry, we really apologize, and we have 15,000 young people out in the street right now in Addis Ababa chanting 350. So we were like, wow, it's all right. Don't worry about the date. And it was all right. It was the beginning of a spectacular 72 hours. There were, in the next 72 hours, 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. And the pictures sometimes were flowing in 20, 30 a minute from around the world. The second one actually came from U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan who just made a 350 with sandbags and sent us a note saying, we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking, okay? I'm just going to show you a tiny fraction of these, mostly because I want those of you who are engaged in this fight, and I know that people from Boone 350 and other great climate activists from all over I know some of you are here tonight. I just want you to see who your brothers and sisters are, and it's a beautiful collection of people. One of the things that I had always heard was that environmentalism was something that rich white people did, and if you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist and blah, blah, blah. It just turned out to be nonsense. It took half an hour of watching these pictures roll in to know that most of the people that we worked with around the world were poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what most of the world is made up of, you know. And what do you know? They're as concerned about the future as anybody else anywhere. I mean, poor places, these people on the Congo River, someplace above Kinshasa, right about where Conrad, in his Eurocentric fashion, identified the heart of darkness on our planet, okay? But they didn't even have a digital camera. You know, they developed the thing in somebody's darkroom. It didn't come out so well, so they had to write in what their banner said. But there they were, completely engaged people all over the world, displaying great wit and tremendous involvement for the first time in this kind of work. This was 2009, by religious communities. There's the head of Muslim South Africa. Next to him, the head of kind of indigenous traditions. Behind them, the Anglican Archbishop at the head of a huge multi-faith march across Cape Town. That's our biggest evangelical college, liberal arts college in the country, Billy Graham's alma mater. I'd been off to the Holy Land to do some organizing. People really wanted to do something because the Dead Sea is shrinking rapidly as temperatures rise, but there are too many military checkpoints in the way. We convened a meeting in Bethlehem, but it was hard even to have the meeting. And so the Jordanians said, we'll make the big 3 on our beach. The Palestinians said, we'll do the 5 in Palestine. The Israelis said, we'll take care of the 0 on our shore. It was a beautiful day. There were 300 big demonstrations across China, which is important. China's now causing a lot of this problem, but it's also putting in renewable energy faster than any nation on earth. A fascinating place in the middle of all this. Those are our brothers and sisters in the Maldive Islands in the Indian Ocean. That's their student government association. I met your student government association, Jalen and his colleagues here today. That's your equivalent in the Maldives, and they're holding their meeting in the lagoon to illustrate the existential problem they face. The Maldives has been inhabited by a continuous culture for 5,000 years, but its odds of making it through this century are somewhat slim because the highest point in this archipelago that stretches across the equator for 1,000 miles, the highest point's a couple of meters above sea level. That's a bad place to be on a rapidly warming planet, okay? But they are not giving up. They are fighting. All over the world, this was the biggest story on Google News for about 36 hours, and I think the reason was that the people taking part didn't look the way that editors thought that environmentalists were supposed to look. So, you know, all the women making that 0 in Yemen, which is about the toughest place on the planet, they're all in full black burqa. So to us, they do not look like the chapter meeting of the Sierra Club, but their hearts are in exactly the same place. They're not thinking about themselves. They're thinking about the future, about their children, about creation. It's a beautiful thing to see. There were 300 or 400 pictures that ended up in a file marked 350 adorable. And they were adorable. And they were also hard to look at. I mean, I look so often at that picture in the eyes of that girl in the middle. Pretty good chance she'll be a refugee in the course of her lifetime. And not from anything she did, from stuff we did, okay? So we've kept on doing this kind of work. The estimate is we might have had about 20,000 demonstrations now in every nation on earth except North Korea, and it's magnificent work. We love doing it. We love meeting people all over the place and in incredibly tough places where people are nonetheless willing to engage in acts of hope and optimism, and in places you would expect, and in cities I'd never heard of, and in cities I'd heard of for other reasons, and place after place after place. We've done these enormous art exhibits. They called it the biggest art project in the world. We did it all over the world one day, and the images were so big, involved so many thousands of people using their bodies to make these pictures that we needed satellites to really capture them. That's my favorite. It's one of those dried up riverbeds in the drought-stricken Southwest, and when the satellite came over, 3,000 or 4,000 people just whipped blue blankets up overhead, and for a minute that river came back to life. I wish we'd just keep doing this. I wish we had 50 years to deal with this problem, because if we did, then the natural, easy evolution of human customs and economies would give us the time we needed to adapt, and we would do this kind of work and people would catch on and on we'd go. We, sadly, do not have 50 years or anything like it. We needed to start 25 years ago, and we didn't. We're way behind. And so sooner than we might have liked, we turned, or added to that kind of educational process, we added a certain amount of confrontation too. These are a few pictures from the start of the fight against the Keystone Pipeline 5 years ago that at the time no one had ever heard of, and so we asked people to come to Washington and get arrested to start this battle, and people did. Very, very peaceful and civil disobedience, and in the end there were 1,253 of us that went to jail, the biggest civil disobedience action about anything in this country for a very long time. And quickly it spread around the world. And back to Washington, and we circled the White House with people, a mile and a half people, shoulder to shoulder, 5 deep, and that fall of 2011, President Obama said, maybe we best give this another look, and perhaps we'll wait until after the election to decide it, which was fine by us. And then he decided to wait till after the next congressional election to decide it, because people had sent more emails to the Senate than on any issue in history, and filed more public comments than on any infrastructure project in America's past, and on and on and on. It became the great environmental battle of our time until last November he finally said, okay, we're not going to build this thing because it would make global warming worse. Now that was a good victory because it keeps a lot of oil, the dirtiest oil in the world, from the tar sands of Canada in the ground every day. But more importantly, it was a great victory because it showed people that the fossil fuel industry could in fact be beaten. And as a result, there is now a fight going on every single place that someone tries to build a pipeline or a fracking well or a coal port or remove a mountaintop or do any of the other things that we cannot be doing at this point in our geological history. The head of the American Petroleum Institute said a few months ago that the biggest problem that the industry now faced was what he called the keystoneization of all their plans, all their projects. I confess that my black heart had a gleeful moment when I heard that said. And we win now a surprising percentage of these things. Shell Oil wanted to go drill in the Arctic last summer. Think about that for a minute. Having watched it melt, as scientists said it would, they did not say to themselves, maybe we should stop looking for oil and start building solar panels. No, they said, well, it's melted. That'll make it easier to drill for more. And so they assembled giant rigs in Portland and Seattle and started to send them out to the Arctic, and instead they ran into a blockade of thousands of people in small craft. We called them kayaktivists. And before the summer was out, Shell had decided it had enough. And, this now goes on everywhere. These are pictures from around the world of the places and spots that are already feeling the effects of climate change, the places where people are having to leave their homes, and the places where drought has gotten so deep or flood gotten so bad. Those are the people in the part of Pakistan that had the worst flood since Noah in 2010. So much rain, the kind of rain that can only fall on a warmed planet, fell and up in the Hindu Kush, and the water came streaming down into the Indus River till it covered a quarter of the country, and 20 million people were out of their homes. And if you look at them, you can guess that they probably didn't do too much to cause the problem that is wrecking their lives. But on and on and on, these effects everywhere. But the resistance now everywhere too, and it's beautiful to see wherever people are trying to these are the kayaktivists hard at work. These pictures are from a march that I know a few of you were on, September of 2014 in New York, and it turned into what was the largest demonstration about anything in this country in a number of years. We had hoped that 100,000 people would assemble. As it turned out, there are a lot of people in this country worried about climate change, tremendously worried. The thing that keeps them, all of us, from doing more, I think sometimes, is that it seems so large and we seem so small against it that it's hard to convince ourselves there's really any point. How could our individual efforts matter? And in some sense, our individual efforts don't matter. My house is covered with solar panels. I've got all the right light bulbs that Amory has told me to put in my house. On and on and on, and I'm proud of it, but I don't try to fool myself that it's stopping climate change. This is a systemic and structural problem rooted in power. And until that power shifts, well, the most important thing of all that an individual can do is not be an individual. It is to come together with others and form movements. That day in New York, we hoped for 100,000, 400,000 people turned out. That's a problem for organizers, but it's the right kind of problem. And it was pretty amazing to see that tide of humanity led by frontline communities, by indigenous groups that have been at the forefront of this fight all along, led by climate scientists and church groups and synagogues just pouring up 6th Avenue into Times Square. It was really spectacular. And around the world, the same thing going on all over the place. Maybe the pictures I'll end with, just to kind of illustrate this, came from the same day or week, but the other corner of the world. And these were the people I were telling you about on those low-lying Pacific Island nations that are going to disappear in the course of this century, perhaps. But their slogan is, "We are not drowning, we are fighting." And they are fighting with great passion on those 10 island nations: Vanuatu, Tuvalu, Palau, Micronesia, the Marshalls, the Solomons. Each island, they cut down a tree and they built a traditional canoe. And then they took those canoes across the Pacific to what's the largest coal port in the entire world, in Newcastle, in Australia. And they used them for the day to blockade that coal port, to keep the biggest ships in the world, those giant ore carriers, from getting out to sea. And the pictures were amazing. They capture the essential geometry of this fight. It is the many and the small against the few and the very, very big and powerful. And it's an epic, epic fight, one that we do not know how is going to come out. But you know, in the months after that standoff in Newcastle, great activists in that part of the world succeeded in blocking plans for what would have been the largest coal mine in the world there in Western Australia. That town, Newcastle, Australia, though it's the biggest coal port in the world, was moved enough that it decided to divest its municipal finances from the fossil fuel industry, to sell off its coal stocks. Something that everybody in every institution that has money should do. It was beautiful. As I say, I have no special insight into all of this. We're completely making it up as we go along. But I know that we need people outside their comfort zone, okay? We need people doing things that are hard. I was thinking as I looked at those pictures, in fact, we were talking about it this afternoon at the brewery over the, did I say, extremely excellent India Pale Ale that they produce. We were talking about that day, that week in Washington when all those people came to get arrested to start the fight about Keystone. And as I look around the sort of beautiful diversity, especially in age, of this room, I'm reminded of one of the things that made that protest so interesting. I'd written a letter asking people to come get arrested, which is not an easy letter to write. And one of the things I'd said in it was, I did not actually think college students should have to be the cannon fodder in this particular instance. Young people are doing most of the leading, as you've seen from these pictures. But if you're 22 right now, an arrest record might not be the best thing for your resume going forward. One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you? So it was real good to see. We did not ask people as they got arrested, how old are you? Because that would be rude. But cleverly, I think, we said, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts came from the FDR and the Truman administrations. The last day, there was There was a man arrested with a sign around his neck that said, "World War II vet, handle with care." He was so old that he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which was so long ago I'd really forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration. Okay. The really nice part was that the young people who were there, and there were lots, got to see their elders for once acting the way that elders should act in a working civilization. It was a good thing. The other thing we told people that day was, if you want to come get arrested, would you put on a necktie or a dress, okay, in order to do it? Now, I wore a necktie today, but that's pretty rare. You can go a long time in Vermont without wearing a necktie. So, it wasn't for love of formal wear. It was just to make a point. The same point I've been trying to make all through this talk, which is there's not a damn thing radical about what we've been talking about. Not a thing. All the environmental movement, the climate justice movement, all it's asking for is a world a little bit like the one that human beings grew up in. A world a little bit like the Holocene. A world that still had, a couple of polar ice caps and maybe a few coral reefs on it. That's not a radical demand. That's a conservative demand, a deeply conservative demand. Radicals work at oil companies. If you wake up in the morning to make your fortune and your plan is to alter the chemistry of the atmosphere, and you're willing to do it once scientists have told you what will happen, and you're willing to keep doing it, and once you've seen those scientist predictions coming true, then you are a radical on a scale that human beings have not had to deal with before. And our job is to figure out how to check that radicalism and do it fast. Now, were I a good organizer, I would just stop there. But I'm constrained by the fact that I'm a writer to tell you the truth as best I can. And the truth is, we're not 100% certain we can win this fight. It's not like the other fights for human liberation that we've come through in the last century. Dr. King always said at the end of talks, he would say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Translated, I think, this may take a while, but we're going to win. Indeed, it's still ongoing, the fight for racial justice. We see it every day around us, but we make progress, and that's good. The climate fight's unlike that. If we don't win it fast, we never will win it, because the world will go past tipping points that make it impossible. And we are clearly near or past some of those tipping points. It's a bad sign when huge physical features that you can see from outer space, like the ice caps, begin to disappear. Okay? The arc of the physical universe is short and it bends toward heat. So there is no guarantee that we're going to win. But there is, and I can say this with assurance because I've spent the last years traveling the world, meeting the people I've been showing you in these pictures, there is a guarantee, at least, that we're going to fight. And that's a very good thing, something we didn't know for sure a decade ago. And that fight is all the more meaningful because we don't know how it's going to come out. It demands of us a kind of certain faith in our species and in our nature and in our abilities. I don't know if we're going to win. I do know that we're going to fight. I do know it's always an honor to be in the room with the people doing that fighting. What an honor to be here with you today at this Energy Summit at its 5th year, to know all the work that you have done in the past and all the work that you will do in the future, and to say I look forward to doing it shoulder to shoulder with you all. Thank you very much. Thank you.